We begin with the president's record-breaking State of the Union address, record-breaking because of the time. It was an hour and 48 minutes long. He touted the economy, his record on immigration, and, of course, foreign policy. President Trump was met by standing ovations from Republicans, while Democrats mostly remained silent and seated. Nancy Cordes has more.
The state of our union is strong.
Speaking to Congress and the country, President Trump argued the first year of his second term was historic.
We ended DEI in America. We gave you no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security for our great seniors. Our country is winning again. In fact, we're winning so much that we really don't know what to do about it.
He hammered that point home by bringing out these winners, the U.S. Olympic men's ice hockey team. The new gold medalists managed to do what most politicians can't: unite a normally divided chamber. But there was still plenty of division, like this moment when Trump sought to put Democrats in a tight spot on immigration.
If you agree with this statement, then stand up and show your support. The first duty of the American government is to protect American citizens, not illegal aliens. You should be ashamed of yourself not standing up.
His move prompted shouting from a small group of Democrats.
Removal of criminal aliens.
Trump hit back on the issue of voter ID, falsely claiming that Democrats have been rigging elections.
They want to cheat, they have cheated, and their policy is so bad that the only way they can get elected is to cheat, and we're going to stop it.
On the economy, Trump said he wants another round of tax cuts, and he touted a new plan to keep electricity prices low when AI companies and tech companies build data centers.
This is a unique strategy never used in this country before. We have an old grid. It could never handle the kind of numbers, the amount of electricity that's needed. So I'm telling them they can build their own plant.
Perhaps the most moving moment came when Trump awarded the Medal of Honor to Army helicopter pilot Eric Slover, who was wounded in the daring Venezuela raid last month. National Guardsman Andrew Wolf was awarded the Purple Heart. He was shot and nearly killed while patrolling D.C. late last year.
With God's help, Andrew has battled back from the edge of death, and we're talking about the edge.
Is the president working for you? We all know the answer is no.
The Democratic response to Trump's address was delivered this year by Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger, who was sworn in last month after serving in the House for 6 years.
He's enriching himself, his family, his friends. The scale of the corruption is unprecedented.
She targeted Trump's personal behavior in office.
There's the cover-up of the Epstein files, the crypto scams, cozying up to foreign princes for airplanes and billionaires for ballrooms, putting his name and face on buildings all over our nation's capital. This is not what our founders envisioned, not by a long shot.
And CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now. Nancy, you know, both the president and the Democratic response honed in on the economy. Everyone tried to own that that issue. The CBS News poll that just came out showed a majority of Americans, of course, rate the economy poorly. Did either side succeed in owning the economy?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the polls show. They both certainly tried. Abigail Spanberger spent a lot of time in her speech going after the president on the economy, on his tariff policies. It's just unclear how many people saw that speech in real time because the president's speech was so long that she got knocked out of prime time on the East Coast. And the president, for his part, spent basically the first half of his 1 hour and 48-minute speech focused on the economy, less dismissive of affordability as a notion than he has been in the past, talking a lot about how he felt that his policies had already helped the country, sometimes overstating by how much. But nevertheless, it was clear that both politicians had gotten the message that this is the biggest issue for Americans in a midterm election year, and with control of the House hanging in the balance. I think a lot of Republican political strategists in particular were glad that the president spent as much time as he did focused on the economy.
All right, so the speech took a turn about an hour in when President Trump, as you know, Nancy, shifted to immigration and his war on fraud. Then, as we saw in your piece from this morning, there were some clashes with Democratic lawmakers. At one point, the president calling Somali Americans Somali pirates. Describe that moment.
Yeah, I mean, the president returned again and again to this theme that a lot of the bad things that we see in American life, people who are victims of fraud, people who are attacked, that these things are happening at the hands of people who have come to this country either legally or illegally. And that really frustrated a couple of Democratic lawmakers in the room who are among those who are the most likely to kind of shout at this president when he is speaking, most notably Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and some of her colleagues. And Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, for example, when the president started talking about fraud in Minnesota, she shouted at him that you've killed people, which was a reference to American citizens that had been killed by federal agents. And so that was sort of the origin of that clash. And then, of course, there was that very striking moment when the president called on members of Congress to rise if they believe that that American citizens should be put before illegal immigrants.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much for all of that context. We appreciate it.
President Trump is facing criticism not only for some of what he said during the State of the Union speech, but also for some of the things he did not address. CBS News congressional correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns joins us from Capitol Hill. So let's talk about some of the reaction that we're hearing from lawmakers to some of the issues that we didn't hear the president talk about last night.
Yeah, Vlad, well, this was seen through a partisan lens. Republicans came away from this speech on Capitol Hill cheering for pretty much everything he said, Democrats doing the opposite. And what Democrats that I was talking to before the speech were looking for was about this pitch on affordability, but specifically how to bring prices down, because that's going to be their midterm message, that the president promised to bring prices down, and he hasn't yet so far. Republicans say this will take time. He's only been in office a year, and the administration's response was they inherited, in their words, a mess. But take a listen to what one Democrat who did not go to the speech, by the way, and we saw a record number of Democrats boycott this speech. Here's what he had to say to our CBS mornings earlier.
The people watching, the voters, the American people are going to be more interested in the dough than the show. And, you know, I think with respect to the affordability issues, he didn't touch on those in the way that he needed to. For example, the American people having concerns about the rising costs of groceries, trying to keep a roof over their head, food on the table, the lights on in the house. He didn't talk about anything that actually would solve any of those problems. In fact, he continues to push tariffs, which are going to have upward pressure on costs and inflation, even though the Supreme Court told them they were illegal.
Now, this is an issue that most presidents in my adult life have been challenged with, this idea of presiding over an economy that people don't feel like is working for them, trying to speak to issues they care about and empathize with that feeling while also trying to plug what you perceive as your economic accomplishments. And that could be kind of the crux of the election coming up later this year, something Democrats certainly want to capitalize. And Republicans, they would prefer the president to do what he did last night, which is talk about perceived successes. That one big beautiful tax bill, for example, that they are calling now the American Families Tax Act. That's something that Republicans want to talk about. So there are Republicans up here kind of breathing a sigh of relief that he didn't venture too far off message and stuck to a lot of the themes that they want to campaign on. Democrats, as you heard, are talking about the opposite.
All right, so did the president, Caitlin, introduce any legislation or did he ask Congress to consider legislation that they'll eventually have to tackle?
The This is what is so interesting about this presidency and this Congress. We talk a lot about how this president has pushed the limits of executive power, but at the same time, this is a Congress that has allowed him to. They have ceded their authority on a variety of different things, especially things that they are specifically tasked to handle. Tariffs, for example, war powers as another example. But last night, the president did talk about a couple legislative items on the agenda. He wants them to pass the SAVE Act, this voter ID legislation that is going to have some trouble getting through both chambers. He also talked about new tax cuts and some other issues like health care, addressing his plan, codifying that into law. I can tell you, Vlad, that one big reason the president doesn't come to Congress with a lot of this stuff is because they have such a narrow margin, especially in the House, to be able to pass anything. I mean, Speaker Johnson can only really lose a vote in his party. And I think something that illustrates that facet right now is what's happening with the scandal involving Representative Tony Gonzalez, that Republican from Texas. He is embroiled in a scandal, alleged to have sent explicit text messages and alleged to have had an affair with a staffer who then committed suicide. The speaker has not called on him to resign. He faces a primary next week, where the speaker says that that'll be handled there. But the overall issue is that, taking a member out at this point poses a lot of challenges to get anything passed through this Congress.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns on the Hill for us. Caitlin, thank you.
Let's now bring in CBS News chief Washington correspondent and host of The Takeout, Major Garrett. Major, thank you so much for joining us. So what did you think about last night's speech in terms of what it might reveal about the president's midterm strategy?
So these speeches are structured. They're structured by any president in a very particular way. And so I would say last night's speech was less about a midterm strategy and much more about a public polling preservation process. What do I mean by that? We know in our CBS poll, disapproval 60%, approval 40%. That's consistent with lots of polls across our country. What's interesting in those numbers is the very strong disapproval ratings this president gets, usually 10 to 15 points above strongly approve. So it's a very personal assessment, and it's a negative one net against President Trump. So what did he do last night to preserve or reorient his public image? He cloaked himself in heroic stories of America and Americans. He made this historically long State of the Union address much less about him personally or his policies, and much more about a long arc of American heroism. 250th anniversary coming up on July 4th, 2 Medal of Honor winners, a Presidential Medal of Freedom, an Honor of Merit, lots of things talking about a broader and heroic aspect of America, which can be, in almost all ways, universally embraced. And then contrasting that with Democrats who didn't seem altogether that comfortable. Remember, these speeches are less about the primetime look-in audience and much more about the algorithmic, repetitive parts of the speech that exist for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 more days. And it's that heroic part that the White House believes will last 2 or 3 or 4 days on the algorithm, and not only cast those people legitimately in a very bright and glowing light, but also the president himself, basking in their reflected glow, taking some, possibly, of the hostility directed at him and his presidency away from him, to put him and fellow Republicans in a better position for a really full-blown midterm strategy later this year.
Although, and that was certainly where we saw moments of bipartisanship, Major, when he awarded those 2 Medal of Honors to those service members, when the USA hockey team came into the room. And yet, to the point that Caitlin was making about some of the language that the president used, for example, when it came to immigration, suggesting that the reason why crime is going down in the United States, why fraud is rampant in the first place and coming down under his administration is because of immigration policies that he's tried to curb. And yet no mention, for example, of mass shootings in this country. No mention of the crime that happens that is not really tied to immigration, but just to crime in general that every country faces. I mean, when you look at mass shootings, where more and more Americans are facing the threat of mass shootings in this country than ever before, 98% of that, according to the FBI, are committed by men. Some 50+% are committed by white men in this country, according to the public mass shootings database. So it just felt that he was trying to still rather than bringing everybody together, those independents who might be on the fence, who may have voted for him back in 2024 and do not like what they saw in Minneapolis or what they saw in Memphis or in New Orleans, are saying, you know what, he is not pivoting to the issues I care about.
That's my question for you, Major.
Right.
How do you think this speech played with independents who played such a big role in electing him for the second term?
I'm glad you raised that because our polling team has some fascinating numbers last night. It found that 27% of the likely audience that was going to watch this characterized themselves as independents. 58% Republicans, 18% Democrats. So maybe just less than a third of the look-in audience was going to be self-identified independents. Then, quite interestingly, our polling team asked the entire pool of our surveys, how many of you think the president might change your mind? 27%, exactly the same number as independents. I think those are very closely aligned. Independents came to this speech thinking the president might change their mind. If they were looking for specific policy or specific remedies, or maybe something that would recast what happened in Minneapolis and say, look, mistakes were made, we're acknowledging that, we are going to re-examine our policies. No, none of that at all. Hard, bright lines, deeply partisan, deeply divisive on immigration, trans rights, voting, and the rest. But this other hero worship thing, which he hopes will have a broader halo effect, but for the base, all the red meat that this president typically dispenses, and he dispensed it on the State of the Union when he knew, because our poll says so and a lot of others do, the largest portion of that audience would be partisan, Trump-supporting Republicans.
So, Major, when you say that 27% of viewers, according to our poll, said that they were likely to have their minds changed by the address,
Could have their minds changed, yes.
We don't know in which way, right? Or
Precisely.
are we assuming that since 60% of those surveyed are disapproving of the president, that most of them would be? Can you just kind of try to square that math for me?
So 60% disapprove currently. But as we know from our own data and from a long history of working through data in our elections and surveys team, things do shift. They don't shift a lot. We are in a pretty partisan-aligned political moment in this country. But independents do sway election to election. They did in 2024, a little bit more to Trump, just enough in the swing states, to Biden in 2020, to Trump in 2016. So they are an interesting and movable constituency. State of the Union addresses are not the kind of thing that is going to systematically change a broad swath of independent voters. But those who looked in might have been looking for something in particular. We'll know in a week or two, based on our own surveys, how much of it all they moved or the president persuaded them. My only point was that's a relatively small segment of the look-in audience, and what they're looking for is known only to them, and we'll have to wait for a while to see how much they were dissatisfied or satisfied.
Major, before you go, a total of 5 Supreme Court justices skipped the State of the Union altogether. Adriana and I were trying to see if that was something that was sort of unprecedented, including those that, justices that are generally in lockstep with the president. Yeah,
like Clarence Thomas.
But I also wonder, given the language that the president used leading up to the State of the Union, he thankfully did not attack the members that actually attended the State of the Union from the podium there. But I just wonder what kind of signaling you see from the president in how he considers checks and balances.
Well, look, the president said the Supreme Court justices who ruled against him were disloyal to the Constitution. That is as insulting a thing a president can say about a sitting Supreme Court justice as can be imagined, let alone spoken. They will always remember that. The Supreme Court, collectively, will always remember that. That is the rankest and most offensive insult you can levy against anyone sitting on the Supreme Court. They don't agree. They know the president is entitled rhetorically to whatever thing he wants to say, whenever he wants to say it. There has been a trend line recently, I would say over the last decade, of less and less Supreme Court attendance at State of the Unions because the Supreme Court justices have sort of informally decided it has become a kind of political hothouse, and they just don't necessarily want to be there. They don't want to get anything directly eyeball to eyeball with the president and don't want to be part of this larger tension and gnashing of teeth over political disagreements. However, I would point out that 2 of the justices who were there, Amy Coney Barrett and Justice John Roberts, were part of the conservative votes against the president on tariffs, and they didn't blink. They were perfectly happy to be there. as was Brett Kavanaugh, who the president name-checked on Friday, is writing the dissent that he tended to agree with. But in general, Supreme Court justices have just looked at the State of the Union as hyper-political and something they'd rather take a pass on.
Major, so lucky we got to chat with you about this morning.
Very happy
Thank
that
you.
you were part of this show today, Major. Thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks.
it.